Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion arranged by Kearney in association with CNBC Arabia. My name is Mayben Kadra, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator of today's session. As part of the What's Next Dialogue series initiated by Kearney, today's panel will discuss future of consumption, how businesses can adapt to a changing consumer mindset. The COVID-19 pandemic has made life infinitely more difficult for people and businesses of every description. Despite the efforts of governments and industry leaders, some major markets are still struggling. Many supply chains face serious disruptions, and most sectors experience continued low demand. What does the future look like for consumption post-COVID-19? What kind of structural shifts did COVID cause in consumer mindset? What are the trends affecting the distribution industry? Here to talk about all of these questions and more are Mr. Debashish Mukherjee. He's partner and head of consumer and retail at Kearney. Mr. Alan Smith, Chief Executive Officer at Aghvia Group. And Mr. Talha Ansari, co-founder of Retailo. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Let me start with you, Mr. Alan. To what extent have we witnessed new business models emerging post-COVID-19 in the fast-moving consumer goods sector?
I think we've definitely seen some fairly significant shifts in business models. I think if you look at what COVID did, was it prompted an acceleration in certain key channels. I would take e-commerce, for example, was around 2% of retail revenue in F&B before COVID. That's definitely increased significantly. Our business in Aghvia increased about 450% on the base of the prior year. Last year, we expect another 250% this year. So we're seeing a big shift in terms of consumer moving to online. We're starting to see it come back in the other direction, because at the end of the day, when people shop for food, they like to go to the shops, they like to see what they're buying. So we saw that peak where e-commerce grew very, very rapidly. We've not seen it slow down in the sense that consumers are still buying online, but certainly we've started to see traditional retail come back. I think one of the other shifts as well, when the pandemic first hit, we saw a bit of a concentration coming into what we describe as modern trade, so your big retail outlets, as consumers were measuring the amount of time they were spending out in terms of visiting the store, and their purchases were increasing. I think what we've started to see post-pandemic, or as we're coming out of the pandemic, is the re-emergence of the local stores. People are shifting back more towards convenience, and they're expecting to be able to buy what they need in one shop. So quite a few interesting changes that we're seeing in the market, but it's changing all the time, and it's a real challenge for us to keep up with the different dynamics in the different channels. Yeah,
that's what I want to discuss with Mr. Debashish, the changing dynamics. When we look at e-commerce, do you expect this growth that we have witnessed during COVID-19 pandemic to continue once everything settles down and this pandemic is over?
Yes, absolutely. And I very much second Alan's numbers and belief that the e-commerce growth, including 450% for his company, have been very similar for other companies at their bases. E-commerce fundamentally in 12 months has moved forward almost by 12 quarters, I would say. The percentage penetration across categories is at least 2 to 3 times higher than where it used to be. I also very much agree that it is coming back to normal levels, but it continues to be very high. So we actually believe that is something which will continue to stick post-COVID. So to answer your question, yes.
So, Mr. Talha, is there a new normal in this sector, in the consumer mindset, in the fast-moving consumer goods, in the retail industry? Is this a new normal for you?
So I think so we have to take a step back and look at on the global scale a few things that have been changed by COVID. One, supply chain has become expensive, and the other, the local economies are struggling with respect to the unemployment rate going up, and the downward shift in the exports that they had. So with now the demand coming back online, we do see that the the consumption will be replaced by a lot of local products. And what we believe is it will move towards localization rather than the whole dynamic or arrangement defaulting back to pre-COVID levels. And it will be the export of technology while the production will be done locally. And this is where we believe that the companies like Retailer will become more and more relevant in terms of upgrading the local supply chain infrastructure.
Okay. I will come back to this idea, the stress that we are seeing on global supply chains, because we thought it will be over once, the end of 2020 came, but obviously we were wrong, and now we're talking about maybe end of next year before it all settles down. But Mr. Allen, I want to ask you a question. Do you think that today the priority for market players in this sector, is it for sustainability of cash flow or executing more CapEx or a capital expenditure?
Look, I think as we look at our business, so the way Agthea is looking at, cash and the way we're looking at CapEx, very much we want to sweat our assets. So what we've set down is we're trying to reduce our CapEx as our percentage of revenue. And what we're trying to do is take the assets we have and see how we can use them more productively, put more volume through existing assets. The other side of this is actually relationships. So looking at smart relationships, outsourcing certain products rather than, there's available capacity in the market rather than investing ourselves. So very much a focus on cash. The other big challenge as well, which you touched on, is obviously cash flow. You're seeing a spike in commodity costs. You're seeing input costs going up across the board. So what you're starting to see is the cost of sales, the pricing going up in the market, the pressure on cash flow becoming greater for every level of the trade. So focusing on how quickly you recover your cash, how you manage your payables, how you optimize your inventory. And actually COVID brought a shock to the whole system because many big companies were always continually optimizing inventory. All of a sudden, when you've got a long supply chain, you now realize that you have a challenge because your inventory is quite tight and you've got worries about being able to supply the market, excess inventory in the system, or can you supply, can you get the product to consumers now in the home? So some real fundamental shifts happened during COVID, and that's actually forced companies to rethink how they work with suppliers, how they work with customers, and how they work with partners to Talha's view that how do we manage our costs and supply chain to be more efficient moving forward?
Because eventually it's affecting their gross margins. So the profitability margin is a very essential thing for...
Profitability margin and cash. I mean, even if you take, Talha would tell you in his business, one of the biggest challenges in fast-growing businesses is actually cash flow, your ability to finance the inventory, to be able to sell it to the market and to recover that cash.
Okay.
So it's very much a question of how do you manage that whole supply chain? How do you manage the cash in that supply chain? And how do you react to some of the future trends that you're seeing? Consumer shifts have been quite significant over the last 12 months, and it's forcing particularly food and beverage companies to think very differently about innovation and what they need to do next. It's just
new dynamics, new environment, and new mindset for the consumer. So, Mr. Debashish, when we talk about supply chains, we all thought that by the end of 2020, this crisis in supply chains will be over. We were wrong, and now we're talking about maybe end of next year. And this is putting a lot of pressure on importers. And now they are faced with two options. Either they will absorb part of the increased costs, and that will pressure their profitability margins, or they will be forced to pass it through to the consumer. How do you think they should take this decision? What are the dynamics and what are the factors that have to be included in this analysis in order to know how to choose?
Yeah, I think maybe the final answer will always be a mix of choosing between passing the price versus maintaining the prices. And you also have to remember this region has many high-income countries like UAE and Saudi. And if you include North Africa and others, there are lots of relatively middle-income and low-income countries. So the ability to pass prices to the consumer is always an option in UAE, Saudi, perhaps some other markets. So it'll be a mix and balance, but Our trends also show the same thing which Tala is saying. Localization is a big theme. Localization costs money. Localization is not free. Okay. So even if you do localization, costs will go up in the short term. And there also has to be much more diversification of sourcing options to make it cost effective. So these are the strategies we believe which all the big suppliers have to do, because at least in the food and beverage sector, goods have to be supplied.
Yes.
But as you can see, in electronics, semiconductors, etc., there are delays of at least 12 months. So people will make the choices.
Because the world was depending on only few countries and only few markets in getting these kind of parts. So it will be very difficult to just suddenly come up with alternatives. And that's what I want to ask you, Talha. When we look at the alternatives, when we look at the strategies that local players will have to, the actions that they have to take in order to localize the supply chains, is there a certain strategy that works in times like this, when there is already a global crisis in supply chains?
No, I think this is the best time when technology could be put into play, right? So I think the existing supply chain in our markets in this region are complicated. It's super manual. And also it's inefficient, and that's largely the kind of relationship which has been there between the companies and the principal, right? Distribution companies, etc. So what essentially we see that the company like ours, when you put are bringing the whole supply chain online and removing the information arbitrage from the overall supply chain. So not only you are supercharging the overall supply chain in terms of the goods movement and what Alan talked about, right? The time it takes to collect the money back and etc. Today, what we see is because in our region, significant, like 65% of the goods are moving through the wholesale channel. And what is it like? The definition of wholesale channel is largely someone is investing their money to push the box forward, right? So that is what they do, that by buying the goods in bulk, they get the better prices and they pass on those prices with time as they deems fit to them. So this is where we come, that where we are connecting these retailers directly to the manufacturers, reducing the number of hands it takes to get for the goods to get there, and driving the operational and commercial efficiency out of it.
Okay, let's talk about the competition in this industry as a general. So do you, Mr. Alan, see that the young consumer today is more demanding post-COVID than he was before? What does that mean for the competitive environment in the fast-moving consumer goods sector?
I think one of the advantages in the Middle East is this has always been a very tech-savvy environment. Fast adapters, people who, the new technology comes out, people, want to buy the latest phone, et cetera, et cetera. So what you're seeing is, whereas in the past, maybe for online retail, there was a little bit of inertia, and as we were talking, COVID's accelerated that. So now people are more than happy to try online apps to buy stuff and to use B2B type supply relationships. But the other thing that's happened on the consumer side is you're seeing a big shift in consumer behavior. People are quite conscious about value because obviously there's been a bit of a pinch in terms of incomes, etc. You're seeing loyalty come into question, and loyalty at every level. Loyalty at a consumer brand level, loyalty at a retailer level. So consumers who would traditionally go to a specific outlet are now much more open to use different platforms or different technologies. You're also getting a bit of that home bird mentality. So you've got people who are, still spending time at home. A lot of us are, have gone back to work. It's all normal for us, but there's still a big proportion of the population who are uncomfortable leaving the house. And then there's other phenomena. People are much more focused on health and wellness.
Yes.
There is a big shift in that direction. So the demand that consumers are putting on manufacturers like ourselves is, we want healthier products. We want to know that it's good for us.
Because we want healthier lifestyle.
Because COVID's brought a shock to us. It's a bit of a shock to the system. And also things like sustainability. These things also matter more to consumers as we move forward. So there's been quite a few things that COVID's kind of accelerated, as well as the e-commerce side, and it's forcing us as manufacturers and F&B companies to think a lot differently about the portfolio we want to manage moving forward, the route to market we want to manage moving forward. And the other important thing is how we engage with consumers as well. That is a big, it's a big learning for us. Digitalization is so important.
So I'm going to get back to these 2 points, and specifically regarding the portfolio construction, because obviously it's just a new environment, new dynamics in this sector. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to go on a quick break. We're going to come back to continue this discussion. Hello and welcome again, everybody. So we're talking and having this panel discussion today to discuss the future of consumption post-COVID-19. I would like to welcome our speakers again. And I want to ask you, Mr. Talha, when we talk about consumers today, when we talk about specific demographics, the young consumer, do you see him as more demanding today than he was before COVID-19? I've asked Mr. Allen this question, and to an extent, we felt like, yes, it is the case. To what extent would you agree with Mr. Allen?
Well, I think definitely the young consumer is demanding. And I would rather use a new age user because we live in a region that is like largely based on young population. So definitely like the new user or the young user or the new age user, they have proprietary choices. They expect personalized products and services. They're always looking for better. So there's always that search for better is always there. The switching cost is pretty low. And since this age group is well like self-aware and also aware because based on the access to information, so they also look for something more than in a product than product. So they try to link it with some kind of
core value.
Yes, the larger impact on the globe and etc. So definitely this segment is a demanding segment, and with COVID in place, this has catalyzed. This has got catalyzed, and that has got catalyzed largely because of the increased usage of internet in terms of higher e-commerce penetration and whatnot.
So, Debashish, how would that impact the portfolio construction for any market player in this industry, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think the portfolio construction related to these trends have to be done very carefully because, yes, the young consumers are demanding in a few things, but our research also says that they're not willing to pay a premium for that. So if you want sustainable products, green products, products which use less water, and you're not willing to pay more. So the portfolio has to be constructed in a way that companies can benefit as well as the consumers. And in some places, we feel that this demanding nature is overplayed. Like at the end, they did buy cars, they did buy houses. We sometimes overplay that the youth is very different, but the research doesn't necessarily say that all the time.
Mr. Allen, prior to our break, you mentioned something about communication with customers post-COVID and that there are new strategies to handle this communication. Can you elaborate more on this?
Look, I think online communications become increasingly important. How you communicate through e-commerce platforms, how you make your brand, first in the queue in terms of when consumers are looking to buy products. All of these are things that you have to improve your ability to understand what consumers are looking for and those first point of impact. So, yes, we've shifted a lot of our traditional marketing investment into digitalized communication. We obviously have to focus around what's important for consumers as well. So without a doubt, it's changing rapidly, and we're constantly looking at research, hearing from peers and our partners as to how the market's moving and how we need to invest differently.
Talha, you were nodding with what Mr. Allen was saying. So to what extent you agree that today, in today's environment, there is a need for new marketing strategies?
No, I think we are living in an era of digitalization. So I think the means to get to the customer have become a lot more easier and targeted as well. And with the e-commerce penetration going up, I think you have more and more access to the data available now. So you don't need to rely on the ATL channels to communicate to your customers. The e-commerce the platforms are enabling this for the companies to get access to their customers directly.
So does that mean that we have, or market players in this industry can have more cost efficiencies because they can, rely more on the digital aspects of marketing, the digital aspects of sales? What does that mean for their costs?
The cost of digital marketing is pretty high, and at scale it can be as high as advertising on TV. So it's a myth that digital marketing is cheap. So then, as my colleagues are saying, it's a question of the choices of targeting the different digital media in the manner in which you want to do it.
But there will have to be some kind of, specific targeting, because usually, normally with marketing, TV marketing, it's less customized and less targeted. So to what extent this specifications and this customizations when it comes to digital marketing will help fast-moving consumer goods market players?
Yeah, I think it is clear that digital marketing has shifted the game in terms of consumer awareness and consideration. I won't completely rule out, based on the facts we see, that television is dead. It has obviously reduced in importance. So I'm not going to say the cool thing about that digital marketing is the only thing. Personalization is also easier said than done. So the returns on all these activities and strategies have to be measured. So my summary is that digital marketing, definitely people are using it. Personalization is good. But still, different products, different markets, it's difficult to give a generalized answer from at least our perspective.
So, Mr. Allen, what are your expectations for consumer spending in 2022 following 2 tough years? Some people witnessed lower income. Some people had lost their jobs. It's different economic circumstances. So what are your expectations when it comes to consumer spending for next year?
It's a very interesting question. I think if we go back to COVID had a big impact on categories, on consumption, on spending. So if you look at the percentage of people in the UAE, for example, who saw a reduction in their income, it's a fairly significant percentage. I think it was in the 70s. So that was really brought a big shock to overall consumption in the market. People made a lot more choices about value, about that value brand proposition, what mattered to them. Actually, we saw some shifts in premiumization, believe it or not, because consumers were no longer going out to restaurants and spending money on these kind of days out. They started to actually want to have a more premium experience at home.
Yes.
So there was some discretionary spend in terms of people saying, okay, I'm not going out and buying, going to a nice restaurant, but I will buy a nice product and bring it in. You saw a lot of businesses pivoting to online. You saw the growth of cloud kitchens. You saw this whole ecosystem start to evolve. To the question about how we see consumption, I think it varies by market. I think some markets economically, Egypt, for example, here in our region, I think the Egypt economy has continued actually to be quite buoyant. We're kind of, I keep using the word cautiously optimistic, but we're starting to see it really translate into consumption, particularly with tourists coming back to the UAE with Expo. So we're starting to see that translate into sales through retail channels and online continuing. So Q4 is starting to look quite encouraging. Hopefully that will be maintained. We've always got to keep at the back of our mind that we've had peaks and troughs over the last 18 months, whereas we've started to see things improving. All of a sudden there's a setback. But I think at the moment we're seeing some solid signs, and hopefully consumers will continue to have that confidence. But things have shifted. You've still got the population, as I said earlier, that are staying at home. still a lot more cautious about resuming normal life. And then you've got the other guys who are like, enough's enough.
So there will be more divergence. So are you as optimistic, Talha, about consumer spending?
Definitely
next year?
yes. So what we are experiencing, especially from the digital companies or tech companies perspective, that the consumer are pushing the boundaries to bounce back to the normalization. And when we talk about ride-hailing companies or the restaurant business, so it's already there 70-75%. So it will take another couple of years to get back to normal. But I will circle back to my point again, that it's not going to default back to the same dynamics as it was pre-COVID. The larger portion of the consumption growth is going to be driven by the locally produced goods, and that's where things are moving. And that's also basically corroborates with the kind of need that the young age people have, right? So more personalized, more proprietary kind of choices they have. So this is what we believe is going to happen.
So, Mr. Debashish, where do you see opportunities in the fast-moving consumer goods industry as general going forward? Because we're talking about more growth expected, in the most optimistic scenario, but new dynamics. So how would you combine these two to create or to see opportunities in the years to come?
Yeah, I think there are opportunities everywhere around new product development, around health, around sustainability, around just better products for the planet, and even buying products from those companies which are doing better for the planet. So, sustainability across the whole value chain. There are innovation possibilities around where they're buying from, whether it's from the local stores, whether it's online, whether it's a combination, which we call omni-channel. So even the channels, there's a lot of innovation possible. There are a lot of channels. There's a lot of innovation possible on the supply chain. So I just feel consumer goods is fundamentally undergoing a transformation on the innovation possibilities across the whole value chain.
I'd like to build on his point. I think innovation in business in the past has meant new products, new product development.
Yeah.
But innovation now is on a different level. It's on route to market, it's on B2B, it's on e-commerce, it's on product, it's on health and wellness, it's on sustainability.
More dependent on technology as well.
Exactly. So technology has become an enabler, and COVID has kind of accelerated, that move in this direction. So it's a very interesting time. You talked a little bit earlier about, the impact of rising costs. What do we need to do as manufacturers? Look, I think inevitably there's going to be inflation. I think right across the board costs are going up. But I also agree with Debashish that we as manufacturers have to think differently. We have to get more efficient in our supply chains. We have to get more efficient.
But doesn't innovation and technology helps this sector and market players in this sector to become more efficient?
Yeah, look, I think more efficient in terms of how we go to market. So how do we get products into stores?
Yes.
How do we get products into consumers' homes? How do we get more efficient on media spend?
And how do you get more resilient supply chain?
How do you get more resilient supply chain? But even the discussion around data, how do we use data? I think one of the big themes in FMCG business is revenue growth management. How do you make sure that when you're investing in a promotion, that it's actually giving you a return on investment? You use data to understand this. AI, how do you understand demand patterns even more? But
of course.
The challenge at the moment is that COVID has shifted everything. So that what was true in the past is no longer true in the future. So it's evolving all the time. So it's a very interesting time to be in this space.
Let me ask you about the opportunities you see in the years to come in the fast-moving consumer goods industry.
So I think one of the things is we do see that there is a significant upgradation that is going to take place on the supply chain side for the big CPGs as well, because especially in the inflationary environment, if you have to grow the business, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on making existing supply chains efficient. Secondly, I think there will be a lot of local brands that are gonna, so the long tail that we used to call it of the consumer goods distribution, that is gonna increase its share in the overall consumption level. One of the research which was done in 2019 and then it was repeated in 2020, in our region, half of the 50% of the goods that were consumed what are the local brands as compared to the big CPGs from where it comes from.
This has been a really interesting topic and discussion. I want to thank you for joining us today at CNBC. Mr. Debashish Mukherjee, he's partner and head of consumer and retail at Kearney. Thank you so much for joining us today. Mr. Alan Smith, Chief Executive Officer at Aghdiya Group. Thank you, sir. And Talha Al-Ansari, co-founder of Retailo. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
So, ladies and gentlemen, the consumer post-COVID is not the same as before this pandemic. Preferences have changed. New consumption patterns have emerged, and all market players will have to adapt to this new environment that may be more competitive than ever. Thank you so much for being with us today. This is the end of our panel discussion. Bye-bye.